Well, there's no more of them, number one. I mean, there'll never be another 63 Dodge or a 65 Chevelle or whatever. There's no more of them. But this is kind of like Fantasyland here, too. I mean, I don't know if this is the real world or not, just to be very honest.
There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a workshop once the person who built it is gone. Tools stay exactly where they were left. Half-finished panels sit on their stands, waiting for hands that are never coming back. For more than a year after Boyd Coddington died, that silence hung over a shop in La Habra, California, a building that had once produced some of the most valuable custom cars in American history. When people finally sorted through what remained, they weren't just clearing out a workspace. They were reading the last physical record of a career that had already rewritten the rules of an entire industry. Let's find out what that record actually says. It's worth asking up front why a hot rod shop deserves this kind of scrutiny at all. Plenty of skilled builders have come and gone in the custom car world without anyone bothering to catalog what was left in their toolboxes. Coddington's case is different because his career didn't just produce good-looking cars. It produced a measurable, documented body of achievement, national trophies, television history, a design vocabulary other builders still borrow from, and auction results that keep climbing years after his death, that together make the contents of that garage genuinely worth examining. This isn't nostalgia for its own sake. It's a real case study in how much value, both cultural and financial, one person's hands can build over the course of a working life. Start with the number that still anchors every conversation about Boyd Coddington's career, 7. That is the count of America's most beautiful Roadster trophies, commonly shortened to AMBR. That cars built in his shop brought home from the Grand National Roadster Show, a total that remains the record in the award's history. Some obituaries written in the panic of the days right after his death cited 6, an understandable mix-up given how fast newsrooms were moving. But the tally recognized by the Grand National Roadster Show itself, and repeated across his Hall of Fame inductions, lands at 7. To understand why that number matters, you have to understand what the AMBR actually measures. It is not a popularity contest decided by a crowd wandering a convention floor. It is judged by mechanics, designers, and historians who evaluate craftsmanship, originality, and finish with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for competition-grade restorations. Winning it once is enough to define a builder's entire career. Winning it 7 separate times, spread across different decades and different cars, is the kind of statistic that turns a shop owner into an institution. That record is only part of the honors list. Boyd was inducted into the Grand National Roadster Show Hall of Fame, the SEMA Hall of Fame, the Hot Rod Hall of Fame, the Route 66 Hall of Fame, and the National Rod and Custom Museum Hall of Fame. His creations also won the Daimler Chrysler Design Excellence Award twice, and one of his cars, built for customer Vern Luce, brought home the Al Slonaker Award at the 1981 Oakland Roadster Show, an early sign that the shop was about to become something much bigger than a local outfit doing custom paint jobs on the weekend. None of that happened by accident, and none of it happened overnight. To understand how a machinist from rural Idaho ended up defining what a hot rod was supposed to look like for the next 40 years, you have to go back to where the whole thing actually started. Boyd Coddington was born in 1944 and raised in rural Rupert, Idaho, a place about as far from the custom car scene of Southern California as you could imagine. He trained as a machinist, working through a formal apprenticeship that taught him to think in tolerances and precision long before he ever applied that discipline to sheet metal. In 1968, he made the move west, chasing a dream that had nothing to do with machining tolerances on paper. He wanted to build hot rods. For years, that dream had to share space with a day job. Coddington worked the night shift as a machinist at Disneyland, then spent his waking daylight hours building cars in a backyard shop at his home in Cypress, California. It was an exhausting arrangement, the kind of double life that only makes sense if the second job is the one you actually love. Eventually, the backyard operation outgrew itself, and in 1977, he opened a proper shop under his own name, Hot Rods by Boyd, in Stanton, California, a modest industrial pocket of Orange County that had no idea it was about to become a pilgrimage site for car collectors. The turning point came almost immediately. Vern Luce's 1933 Ford Coupe, built in that early shop, won the Al Slonaker Award in 1981, and suddenly Coddington had more than a hobby. He had a reputation. Word spread about a builder who was doing something different with an already well-worn subject, the classic pre-war Ford Roadster and coupe. Where other builders piled on chrome and trim, Coddington's shop shaved door handles, smoothed body lines, and stripped away anything that looked bolted on rather than born into the design. People in the scene started calling it the Boyd look, and once you learned to recognize it, you could pick a Coddington build out of a lineup without needing to see the badge. As the shop's reputation grew, so did its footprint. The operation eventually relocated to a larger facility in La Habra, California, a move that matched the rising scale and ambition of the projects coming through the doors. In 1988, Coddington launched a second business, Boyd's Wheels, built around a technique he had been refining for years, machining custom wheels directly from solid billet aluminum instead of casting them. The wheels were originally designed to match specific cars, one-off pieces meant for one-off builds, but they caught on so widely that the nickname stuck to the man himself. People started calling him Billet Boyd, and the wheel company eventually grew large enough to be taken public. That expansion came with real financial risk, and it caught up with him at least once. In 1998, a bankrupt customer left Coddington with a loss of roughly $465,000, a hit serious enough that he reorganized Boyd's Wheels and brought his eldest son into the business as a partner. It is a detail that rarely makes it into the highlight reels of his career, but it matters because it shows that even at the height of his fame, the business behind the legend was still a business, vulnerable to the same pressures that sink any company built around one person's name and one person's eye. By the mid-1990s, a car that rolled out of hot rods by Boyd was not simply a vehicle with a few aftermarket upgrades bolted on. It was, in most cases, a ground-up creation where the donor car might only contribute its basic silhouette, with the rest of the body reshaped by hand, panel by panel, over the course of months. That level of labor does not come cheap, and Coddington's pricing reflected it. Commissions for a single custom build reportedly reached into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a figure that turned heads even among people accustomed to expensive cars, because this wasn't a factory supercar with a manufacturer's suggested price. This was one man's shop, charging luxury brand money for objects built almost entirely by hand. One of the clearest examples of just how far that pricing philosophy could stretch is CadZZilla, arguably the single most famous car ever to come out of the shop. In 1989, ZZ Top guitarist Billy Gibbons commissioned Coddington to build a hot rod out of a 1948 Cadillac Fastback, a heavy, elegant post-war body with barely their tail fins. What came back bore almost no resemblance to the donor car. The roof was chopped, the rear deck reshaped, and nearly every exterior panel replaced with hand-formed metal, producing a car that looked like a designer's fantasy sketch brought to life in steel and lead. Collector car analysts have since speculated that if Gibbons ever decided to sell it, CadZZilla could fetch 7 figures on the open market. Decades after it was built, the car found a second life as a museum piece, featured in an exhibit at the Saratoga Automobile Museum, a fitting home for a vehicle that had already crossed the line from custom hot rod into recognized automotive art. That kind of showpiece pricing wasn't limited to celebrity commissions, either. The shop's output regularly attracted collectors who treated a Coddington build less like transportation and more like an investment-grade object, something you bought expecting the value to hold or climb, rather than depreciate the way an ordinary car does the moment it leaves the lot. It's a strange business model to build around one person's name and one shop's output, but for a stretch of nearly 3 decades, it worked, and it worked well enough that television came calling. When cable network TLC, and later Discovery, greenlit a series called American Hot Rod, they weren't just filming a workplace reality show. They were pointing cameras at a shop that operated under standards strict enough to have already produced a record 7 AMBR trophies, and the show gave the public an unfiltered look at what that level of precision actually cost the people delivering it. The series became known almost as much for the tension inside the shop as for the finished cars rolling out of it. Staff turnover was high, arguments were frequent, and the pressure of hitting broadcast deadlines on top of Coddington's exacting standards pushed more than one talented fabricator out the door, including, for a period, his own son. That environment produced some remarkable graduates. Chip Foose, who worked as a designer in Coddington's shop, from 1989 to 1996, went on to become one of the most recognized names in the custom car world in his own right, eventually hosting his own competing show, Overhaulin'. Jesse James, who apprenticed under Coddington before starting his own shop in 1992, became a household name through his own television career. Whatever else can be said about the working conditions inside Hot Rods by Boyd, the shop clearly functioned as a proving ground, a place where an entire generation of builders learned their craft under a boss who apparently accepted nothing less than his own exacting standard. The show also documented, whether intentionally or not, exactly how much of the shop's output depended on one man's eye and one man's approval. Coddington himself reportedly could not sketch or draw. His talent was conceptual, an ability to see a finished car in his head and communicate it clearly enough for a team of skilled fabricators to build it by hand. That dependency on a single vision is precisely what made the events of February 2008 so consequential, not just for the people who worked there, but for the entire brand built around his name. Boyd Coddington died on February 27, 2008, at Presbyterian Intercommunity Hospital in Whittier, California, following a lengthy hospital stay after surgery. He had lived with diabetes for years, and in the weeks before his death, he had been hospitalized after a fall at home, readmitted, and put through surgery, from which he never fully recovered. His publicist later confirmed that complications including kidney and liver problems, layered on top of the underlying diabetes, ultimately caused his death. He was 63 years old, and he was buried at Rose Hills Memorial Park in Whittier, not far from the shop that had defined his entire adult life. What happened next is where this story stops being simply about trophies and price tags and becomes something closer to a case study in what happens when a business is built entirely around one irreplaceable person. Coddington's wife, Jo, took over daily operations in the immediate aftermath, trying to keep both the hot rod shop and the wheel company running with the existing team of machinists, fabricators, and painters still in place. For a few months, it looked like it might work. It didn't. Running two demanding operations without the person whose name, eye, and final approval had held the whole enterprise together proved to be more than any single successor could manage. On June 20th, 2008, less than 4 months after Coddington's death, Hot Rods by Boyd officially closed its doors in La Habra. The staff was let go. Cars and builds that were still in progress at the time of the closure were split up and moved to 2 new shops, both started and run by former Coddington employees who wanted to keep working with the tools and techniques they had learned under him, even without his name over the door. The wheel business had its own separate afterlife, eventually being acquired by another company that continued producing wheels under the Coddington name. Reading through the forums and message boards where enthusiasts tried to process the closure in real time, one sentiment comes up again and again, stated in slightly different words by dozens of different people. Boyd was the shop. Take him out of the equation. And even people who owned his cars, people who had every reason to want the brand to continue, seemed to agree that whatever came out of a shop without him in it would never quite be a Boyd car in the way the earlier ones had been. That belief, right or wrong, had a direct and measurable effect on how the market started treating everything he had already built. Grief has a strange relationship with scarcity, and nowhere is that clearer than in what happened to Coddington's cars. Once it became obvious there would never be a new one, enthusiasts and collectors who had spent years watching his prices climb steadily now understood, with total certainty, exactly how many Boyd Coddington originals would ever exist. That number stopped growing the moment he died, and the market responded accordingly. Some of the clearest evidence comes from CheZoom, a wild, aircraft-inspired custom built for client Joe Rudke years earlier. When it came up for public sale in 2005, while Coddington was still alive and still building, it sold for $372,600, a price that already signaled the shop's work was being treated less like a hobbyist's custom car and more like a fine art acquisition. The Alumatub tells an even more detailed story, because it changed hands multiple times and left a price trail you can actually follow. Built in just 8 weeks by a crew of roughly 15 shop fabricators to meet a punishing television production deadline, representing something in the neighborhood of 4,800 labor hours before you even account for materials and design fees. The car first sold at auction in 2005 for $167,400 to collector Ron Pratt. Pratt held on to it for a decade before selling it again in 2015 for $187,000, a modest but real increase. It changed hands again in January 2017 at a Barrett-Jackson auction in Scottsdale, Arizona, this time bringing $132,000, offered without a reserve price, meaning the seller accepted whatever the room was willing to pay. Other examples of his shop's work followed a similar pattern of steady, sometimes eye-catching value. A chopped, flamed 1932 Ford three-window coupe built with Coddington's signature billet wheels sold for $200,000 at a Barrett-Jackson auction, a price that one detailer who had personally prepared the car for sale insisted didn't come close to covering what it would have actually cost to build from scratch given the cost of one-off billet components and custom paintwork alone. A 1957 Cadillac built as an Elvis tribute car, commissioned as a promotional vehicle and featured on American Hot Rod, later crossed the auction block at Barrett-Jackson as well, joining a long list of Coddington creations that continued to surface at major sales more than a decade after the shop's doors closed for good. Even the unfinished work carried weight in the marketplace. In January 2015, 3 incomplete 1940 Ford Customs from Coddington's shop, built out in 3 different configurations, a coupe, a convertible, and a station wagon, came up for sale at a Scottsdale auction. None of them were road-ready. All of them were still recognizably, unmistakably Coddington builds, with the shop's signature proportions and details already visible in the unfinished bodywork. The sale became something of a natural experiment for the collector community, a real-time test of a genuinely difficult question. Once the builder is gone, does an unfinished project become a mistake nobody wants, or does it become a kind of artifact, a preserved glimpse into a process that will never happen again? The fact that serious money changed hands for cars that weren't even close to finished suggests the market had already made up its mind. People weren't just buying rolling stock. They were buying proof, physical, documented proof that a specific pair of hands had shaped that specific piece of metal, and that no other pair of hands ever would. That instinct, treating an incomplete Coddington build as something closer to a preserved sketch than an abandoned project, mirrors exactly how the art world treats an unfinished painting left behind by a major artist. Nobody expects a stranger to pick up the brush and finish it in the artist's style, because the value was never really in the finished image alone. It was in the documented, verifiable act of that particular person having started it. Collectors who bought into those 1940 Ford Customs and the various other partially completed builds that have quietly changed hands since 2008 seem to have understood that distinction instinctively, even if none of them would have phrased it in those exact terms. It would be dishonest to tell this story as though every single person who worked with Boyd Coddington remembers him with pure admiration, because that isn't quite the full picture. Behind the trophies and the television fame sat a business that, like a lot of businesses built around one demanding personality, generated its share of friction. The 1998 loss from a bankrupt customer wasn't the only financial headache the operation weathered over the years. In discussions among longtime hot rod enthusiasts, some who claimed to have worked closely with the shop described consignment arrangements gone wrong, situations where cars were sold on behalf of owners, but the original owners were never fully paid out. Whether those accounts reflect isolated incidents, larger patterns, or some combination of business mismanagement and simple hard luck is difficult to verify at this distance, and it would be unfair to present second-hand forum grievances as settled fact. What is verifiable is that Coddington's businesses did experience real financial strain more than once, and that not every relationship forged inside that shop ended cleanly. The television show didn't help soften that reputation either. American Hot Rod was built around visible tension, raised voices, blown deadlines, and a boss whose standards left little room for excuses, and viewers who only knew Coddington through that lens sometimes walked away with the harsher impression of the man than the trophy case alone would suggest. Some of his own former employees have said publicly that they found the on-camera version of the shop exhausting to work inside, and it's worth remembering that several of his most talented collaborators, including his own son for a period, eventually chose to leave rather than keep working under those conditions. None of that erases the craftsmanship. and none of it changes the trophy count or the auction results. But a complete account of what was sitting inside that La Habra garage has to include the fact that the man who built it was, by multiple accounts, a genuinely difficult person to work for, someone whose perfectionism produced extraordinary cars, and, apparently, no shortage of exhausted, occasionally resentful employees along the way. Legacies are rarely as clean as a highlight reel, and Coddington's is a useful reminder of that. The garage held proof of both things at once. A level of craftsmanship almost nobody else in the industry could match, and a working environment that plenty of talented people were eventually happy to leave behind. Whatever tension existed inside the walls of that shop, it didn't stop an entire generation of builders from treating Coddington's approach as the standard to measure themselves against, and that influence didn't disappear when the doors closed in 2008. Chip Foose, who spent 7 years training under Coddington before striking out with his own design studio, has spoken over the years about how much of his own eye for proportion traces directly back to lessons learned on that shop floor. His own television career, and the accolades that came with it, effectively extended the Coddington approach to design into a second generation of builders and viewers who never set foot inside the original shop. Jesse James took a different path, but drew from the same well, apprenticing under Coddington before launching his own operation in 1992 and eventually becoming one of the most recognizable names in custom fabrication in his own right. Between Foose and James alone, Coddington's direct influence touched 2 of the most visible careers in modern custom car building, and that's before you count the dozens of less famous fabricators, painters, and machinists who passed through his shop over 3 decades and carried what they learned into workshops all over the country. The design language itself outlived the man just as thoroughly as his former employees did. The Boyd look, that instantly recognizable combination of smooth panels, shaved trim, and proportions borrowed from classic pre-war bodies, but rendered with modern precision, still shows up in builds from shops that have no direct connection to Coddington at all. Ask almost anyone serious about hot rod history to describe what separates a well-executed custom from an overdone one, and you will hear echoes of the exact philosophy Coddington was preaching back in Stanton in the late 1970s. Take away anything that doesn't need to be there, and make what remains as clean as the metal will allow. That is, in the end, the real answer to what was sitting inside Boyd Coddington's garage after he died. It wasn't just unfinished cars and idle machinery. It was the physical remains of a teaching style, a set of standards that had already been copied, adapted, and passed down before anyone ever had to sort through what was left in the building. Put all of that together, and the picture that emerges isn't really about dust, or locked doors, or a workshop sitting untouched after its owner's death. It's about what a workshop can become once it stops being an active business and starts being a historical record instead. Every welding table, every hand-cut jig, every half-shaped body panel that existed in that La Habra shop on the day Boyd Coddington died represented a piece of a career that had already produced 7 national championship trophies, a roster of Hall of Fame inductions spanning 5 separate institutions, at least 2 builders who went on to become famous in their own right, and a body of finished work that continues to climb in value at major auctions nearly 2 decades after his death. The secret his garage held was never some hidden invention or unreleased masterpiece waiting to be discovered behind a tarp. The secret was simpler and, in a way, more sobering than that. It was the realization, arrived at slowly by an entire industry, that an entire category of automotive craftsmanship, the specific blend of machinist precision and sculptor's eye that Coddington brought to every project, had a hard, physical limit on how much of it could ever exist. Once he was gone, that limit became final. Every unfinished panel left on a workbench in La Habra stopped being a work in progress and became, instantly, the last of something. That is the real weight sitting inside Boyd Coddington's old shop, whether anyone actually opens the doors to look or not. 7 trophies that no other single builder has matched. Cars that keep resurfacing at major auctions for 6 figures, sometimes with barely any bodywork attached. A television show that, whatever people thought of its manufactured drama, accidentally documented the last few years of a genuinely rare kind of craftsmanship in real time. And a shop that, once it went quiet in the summer of 2008, never had a single new car roll out of its doors again. Think about how rare that combination actually is. Most influential craftsmen fade slowly, their output tapering off as retirement approaches, giving the market years to adjust to the idea of scarcity before it actually arrives. Coddington's ending was abrupt instead, a sudden stop in the middle of an active television production, with commissioned projects still sitting half-built on the shop floor. That abruptness is part of why the story still generates interest almost 2 decades later. There was no farewell tour, no final retrospective build designed to cap off a career. There was simply a Wednesday morning in February when the man behind the name stopped showing up, and an industry that had to figure out, in real time and without a script, what his absence actually meant for everything he'd already made. What part of Boyd Coddington's story surprises you the most? The record-setting trophy count, or the fact that even his unfinished cars still command serious money at auction? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the builders who actually shaped the cars we still argue about today, stick around for the next one.